Chapter 6. A Cast-Off Leader Goes to War. All they cared for was food. It was not our lives. And if all these Indians had been properly fed and otherwise treated like human beings, how many, very many innocent lives might have been spared. Sarah Wakefield, 1864. Teoeateduta is not a coward. He will die with you. Teoeateduta, 1862.
On August 17, 1862, a few young Dakota hunters went to the cabin of a settler, Robinson Jones, near Acton, Minnesota. There are several stories to explain what happened next. One story says the men wanted to buy whiskey from Jones, but he refused to sell them any. He had sold them whiskey before, and his refusal angered them. Another story says the men found a hen's nest along the fence near Jones's house. One man took eggs from the nest and asked for a pot to cook them in. When the woman of the house heard about the stolen eggs, she shoved the Dakota man right out of her cabin. Someone in the hunting party accused the man of being a coward. He answered by calling out to his friends, "Come with me and show some of your bravery." Then he marched right back to the cabin. Whatever the reason, Dakota hunters killed 5 white settlers at the cabin and elsewhere near Acton. That night, the hunters arrived at the Soldiers' Lodge at Redwood. When members of the lodge learned what had happened, they knew that all Dakota people would be affected. The U.S. government would surely refuse to pay the annuity. Officials would demand that the killers be turned over, and they would no doubt take money, probably a very large sum, from the annuity to compensate the families of the dead settlers. The Dakota could not afford to lose money. They were starving. Most owed all of their annuity payments to the traders. Members of the Soldiers' Lodge grew angrier and angrier, too angry to consider working out a deal or turning in their friends. They were ready for war. All they needed was a leader who could unite the Dakota people. Teoeateduta was asleep when the men arrived. On the ground floor of his house was a low, sofa-like shelf built into a wall. There, Teoeateduta and his family slept. And there, in the big ground floor room, the members of the Soldiers' Lodge crowded around the former leader's bed just before dawn. When the men told Teoeateduta what had happened and asked him to lead them to war, he flatly refused. He said they were fools to fight the Wasichu and fools to ask him. After all, he wasn't the speaker for the Mdewakanton. They should ask Traveling Hale, who had won the election. But the men persisted. Someone argued that the whites must be pretty hard up for men to fight in the South, or they would not come so far out on the frontier and take half-breeds or anything to help them. Surely the Great Father was too busy to counter a Dakota attack. Teoeateduta reminded warriors of the vast cities he had seen on his trips to Washington, D.C. He tried to argue them out of waging such a hopeless war, but his arguments fell on deaf ears. The men taunted him. Had Teoeateduta grown old and tired? Was he no better than a farmer, hiding food in his cellar? Was he a coward? Teoeateduta is not a coward, he answered hotly, and he is not a fool. No Dakota warrior could stand by quietly when called a coward. Teoeateduta launched into a speech that his oldest son, Winonape, remembered perfectly, even years later. Braves, you are like little children. You know not what you are doing. You are full of the white man's devil water. You are like dogs in the hot moon when they run mad and snap at their own shadows. We are only little herds of buffalo left scattered. The great herds that once covered the prairies are no more. See, the white men are like the locusts when they fly so thick that the whole sky is a snowstorm. You may kill 1, 2, 10, yes, as many as the leaves in the forest yonder, and their brothers will not miss them. Kill 1, 2, 10, and 10 times 10 will come to kill you. Count your fingers all day long, and white men with guns in their hands will come faster than you can count. Yes, they fight amongst themselves, a way off. Do you hear the thunder of their big guns? No. It would take you 2 moons to run down where they are fighting, and all the way your path would be among white soldiers as thick as tamaracks in the swamp of the Ojibways. Yes, they fight amongst themselves, but if you strike at them, they will all turn on you and devour you and your women and your little children, just as the locusts in their time fall on the trees and devour all the leaves in one day. You are fools. You cannot see the face of your chief. Your eyes are so full of smoke. You cannot hear his voice. Your ears are full of the roaring waters. Braves, you are little children. You are fools. You will die like the rabbits when the hungry wolves hunt them in the hard moon. But the old leader couldn't end his speech without replying to the men's taunts. Was he really too old and tired to lead? Was he a coward? No, he said firmly. Teowateduta is not a coward. He will die with you. Teowateduta had been raised to value bravery, but it took more than the fear of seeming a coward to drive him into battle. With a name like Teowateduta, his red nation, he had always seemed destined to lead, impatient to show off his greatness. Yet his own people had cast him aside. Here was a chance to lead again. Teowateduta wasn't willing to wait for another chance. He would lead a war against the Wasichu, even a hopeless war. Over the years, Teowateduta had gained a reputation as a warrior against the Ojibwe. Now his enemy was different, but his strategy was the same. The Dakota would strike quickly, killing the whites at Redwood. They would raid the great stone warehouses for food and guns and powder. Then they would attack nearby settlements and the fort. If they could take Fort Ridgely and the largest Wasichu town in the region, New Ulm, they would continue east to the Mississippi River, pushing white settlers in front of them. All this was possible if the warriors acted quickly before soldiers arrived from the east. The first attack went well for the Dakota. On the morning of August 18th, Dakota men surrounded the warehouse and trading posts at Redwood. They quickly killed about 20 people, including the trader Myrick, whose mouth they stuffed with grass. But almost as soon as the killing ended, the warriors' organization began to fall apart. Many began looting houses and trading posts. Men wore sunbonnets stolen from the chests of women's clothes. They tied gold watches to their ankles as decorations. Many drank whiskey from the traders' stores. They gorged themselves on food until they were too full to do anything but sleep. Others captured enemies of the Dakota who hadn't managed to get away from the agencies in nearby settlements. They would hold these captives prisoner as long as they were at war. When Teoyateduta tried to attack Fort Ridgely, he couldn't find enough warriors to join him. Quick attacks, aided by the element of surprise, were not to be. Teoyateduta wanted to attack the fort early and quickly, but his men preferred to loot. Until he could gain the ear of his warriors, he could not be the strong leader he wanted to be. People gathered around Teoyateduta's house. The once shrinking village grew into a bustling town overnight. Dakota set up teepees and lodges, waiting to find out what was going on. Many had been startled by the war. One Dakota girl remembered thinking that the gunfire at Redwood must be from an attack of Ojibwe or Chippewa Indians. "Hurry!" the girl's mother had cried. "The Chippewa must be here." Other people gathered around Teoyateduta's house were captives, some white, some of both Dakota and white backgrounds. All were confused and scared. Warriors forced captives and farmer Dakota to wear traditional clothes. Teoyateduta sometimes seemed annoyed by the captives and the need to feed and clothe them. One white woman, who had been generous to Teoyateduta before the war, asked the leader for some food. He became very cross, she remembered. Pointing to a sack of flour, he said, "There is flour. If you are hungry, make yourself some bread." And then he left the house. Teoyateduta may have viewed captives as bargaining chips. If he needed to make peace, or if any of his people were captured, then he could use the captive women and children to make the whites listen to him. Teoyeteruta did what he could to keep the young warriors from threatening the captives, and he made some of the captives comfortable in his own home. Susan Brown, the wife of the former agent, stayed with Teoyeteruta after she was captured. Susan was related to many important Sissetons and Wapitons. Teoyeteruta hoped to have their help in the war, so he made sure Susan had everything she might need. He also explained to her why he was fighting against the Wasichu. As her son Samuel recalled, Teoyeteruta said to her that he wanted her to know all about the troubles that have so suddenly come upon his people. He said in substance that his young men had started to massacre, that he at first opposed the movement with all of his might, but when he saw he could not stop it, he joined them in their madness against his better judgment, but now did not regret it, and was never more earnest in his life. On August 20th, Teoyeteruta had finally gathered enough warriors to attack Fort Ridgely. The Dakota fought the whites just as they would have ambushed the Ojibwe in the forest, firing their weapons from behind trees or clumps of grass. White soldiers were not used to this strategy. As one warrior put it, the white men stood up and exposed themselves at first, but at last they learned to keep quiet. Although the whites suffered more casualties than the Dakota, they did not give up the fort. Teoyeteruta returned for another attack on August 22nd. This time, 400 Sissetons and Wapitons joined the fight. Even with these reinforcements, the Dakota were forced to retreat. The same thing happened when Dakota led 2 attacks on New Ulm. The Dakota burned down most of the town, but the whites held out. By late August, Teoyeteruta was complaining to Susan Brown of a headache. At first he joked that it happened when he hit his head dodging a cannonball at the fort. But then he went on more seriously. "I am worried," he told her. "Ammunition is giving out. We could of course use clubs, sticks, and stones and drive the whites out of the country. But that would take a long time." Time was running out for the Dakota. Teoyeteruta had gotten word that Henry Sibley was leading a large army. The army was on its way to Redwood to fight the Dakota. Teoyeteruta urged his people to move north to Yellow Medicine. He hoped to find support there among his Sisseton friends and relatives. Instead, Paul Mazakutamani, his relative from Lac Parle, was leading a group of Farmer Dakota and Blanket Dakota who opposed the war. Little Paul, as he was known, was just as skilled a speaker as Teoyeteruta. Even some of the leader's own warriors had to agree when Little Paul warned, "No one who fights with the white people ever becomes rich, or remains 2 days in one place, but is always fleeing and starving." Little Paul urged the Dakota to make peace with the whites and return the captives, but for the moment, the Dakota seemed to be gaining the edge in the war. The Dakota lost relatively few men in the fighting, yet they had killed more than 500 whites. Most of the dead were settlers. Some were women and children. Teoyeteruta warned his warriors that the Wasichu would never forgive the deaths of women and children, but some civilian deaths could not be avoided in war. On August 31, the leader and his warriors held a council on the prairie. With their blankets wrapped around them, they talked of their plans late into the night. One group, led by Teoyeteruta, would go into the big woods. They would attack settlements. Another group would head towards New Ulm. On the way to New Ulm, however, warriors discovered a group of white soldiers camped for the night near a creek called Birch Coulee. When the Dakota saw the soldiers' campsite, they knew they had to attack. The white men had chosen a spot that was nearly impossible to defend. Over 2 days, Dakota warriors shot at soldiers and their horses, killing all of the latter. They took breaks to drink water from the creek while the white soldiers suffered from terrible thirst, and they ate food prepared by their wives at campsite just out of the range of the soldiers' guns. The fighting only stopped when more soldiers came to save those few still trapped at Birch Coulee. Meanwhile, Teoyeteruta attacked settlements in the Big Woods. Many whites fled to the east. When he arrived back at Yellow Medicine on September 7, Teoyate Duta hoped his victories would gain him support, but that support didn't come. He wanted to move his warriors and their captives farther north, but some Sasitans resisted. "I live by the white men and by the buffalo," said one Sasitan. "I fear that you are going to annihilate all these for me. Therefore you shall not advance north of here." Yet Teoyate Duta did move north, slowly, in a long and noisy train of people in wagons, on horseback, and on foot. His attention was turning towards plans for another battle. By September 21, Sibley had reached an area near Yellow Medicine called Wood Lake. Teoyate Duta wanted to attack the sleeping soldiers at night. Others argued that a morning attack, when the troops reached Yellow Medicine, would work best. About the same time, Teoyate Duta sent Sibley a note saying, "I want to know, from you as a friend, what way that I can make peace for my people." But a warrior can't make peace and war at the same time. Sibley didn't reply to the note. Teoyate Duta and his men began their attack early on September 23, when Sibley's army was leaving camp for Yellow Medicine. A small group of soldiers was sent ahead to dig potatoes. They surprised Dakota warriors, waiting to ambush the whole army. The battle didn't go at all as planned. Sibley's soldiers turned cannons on the Dakota before they could complete their attack. Teoyate Duta and his warriors retreated. By the time Teoyate Duta returned to camp, he knew the war was lost. Farmer Dakota and others friendlies to the white had stolen away most of the captives. Teoyate Duta's last bargaining chips were gone. Susan Brown's son, Samuel, described the leader as despondent and heartbroken. Teoyate Duta's voice was full of disappointment when he summed up how the war had gone. 700 picked warriors whipped by cowardly whites. Better run away and scatter over the plains like buffalo and wolves. After this last speech to his people, Teoyate Duta told his wives and supporters to get ready for travel. A long, cold winter lay ahead. Early on the morning of September 24, Teoyate Duta rode over the prairie and left his red nation behind. Coming to a rise, he turned his pony around for one last look. "We shall never go back there," he said.